Noam Chomsky. All right. So Noam Chomsky, we all know who Noam Chomsky is, right? He's this famous linguist. He was a very famous linguist, Noam Chomsky was. And Noam Chomsky, very famous linguist, and during the Vietnam War, he opposed the Vietnam War. He came from a Communist Party family, a family that was linked to his mother was a member of the Communist Party USA, and he was a very good student. He talks about when he was a child, realized he was a good student, got straight A's, and he was very interested in anarchism and left-wing ideas. And he became a professor at MIT because he was an award-winning linguist, and that his linguistic academic work was very highly praised. And during the Vietnam War, he became outspoken against the Vietnam War. He refused to pay his taxes in protest of the Vietnam War. He made a point as this famous academic speaking at anti-war rallies. And so over the course of the 1960s, 70s, and especially in the 80s, Noam Chomsky became one of the primary talking heads of left-wing ideas in the United States. Now, most Americans never heard of Noam Chomsky. He was a very obscure intellectual. He went on PBS every so often. He would go around to college campuses and give talks about politics and such. But, he was, for people in the United States that were interested in Marxism and socialism, he was very well known. He was one of the big names, but average Americans never heard of him, right? Even his name sounds weird. Noam Chomsky. It's like a kind of an obscure name, right? It's not like Joe Smith or Joe Bob or something like that. David Smith or Robert Smith or Joe Miller. I think the most common last name in the English language is Miller. But Noam Chomsky in the 1980s played a particularly good role because he highlighted U.S. crimes in El Salvador and Nicaragua. He talked about U.S. support for Israel and Israel's crimes against the Palestinians, and he was an outspoken critic of U.S. foreign policy. But Noam Chomsky always played this game where whenever you asked him about the Soviet Union or China or Cuba, oh no, they were just as bad. They were just as bad, right? Oh, they're evil human rights violators. They're just as bad. And Noam Chomsky, again, those who were actually familiar with U.S. foreign policy often would look at his work and say, what's so profound about this? Basically, so many of his books, Pirates and Emperors, and What Uncle Sam Really Wants, and I think I've got a box set of his like short little pamphlets. You read a lot of his books, it's basically, he says, well, the USA is accusing this government around the world of committing crimes. Everything they say about them is true, but the USA commits crimes and backs extremists and terrorists and bombs and kills civilians also. There's nothing remote. I mean, it's not really that profound. If you've never heard it before, it's extremely profound. You think, wow, right? And I remember I first read Noam Chomsky after 9/11 because I was getting interested in socialism and communism, kind of in a vague, kind of hippie, utopian way. I was really, I was just a teenager, and then 9/11 happened. And so I didn't quite know what to make of it because, all of a sudden there's just all this patriotism. My little town in Ohio turned into like a 24/7 military rally. Everyone's waving flags. And I didn't quite know what to make of it. And Noam Chomsky, I remember going to Barnes & Noble. And at Barnes & Noble, they had a book called Power and Terror by Noam Chomsky. And I read it, and Noam Chomsky in the book says, yes, the terrorists on 9/11 committed horrendous crimes, but the USA has committed crimes around the world. Have you never heard this before? If you never talked about the history of U.S. regime change operations and coups and crimes, that sounds amazingly profound. But once you dig into this stuff, once you're familiar with the history of U.S. foreign policy, if you're somebody who has studied this stuff, what Chomsky's saying seems very, very surface level. It's like, yes, the USA commits horrendous atrocities as well. No shit, Sherlock, right? Yes, Vietnam, millions of people dead, backing the Contras in Nicaragua, the paramilitaries of Colombia, yes, US-aligned regimes around the world have committed horrendous atrocities. Like, it's not that profound of a message. But mixed in with Noam Chomsky's, criticism of U.S. foreign policy, which is common sense. It's just U.S. media never acknowledges it, right? It's, for anyone who's familiar with it, it's kind of common sense, but U.S. media, likes to be very, very one-sided. Mixed in with that, he has this anti-communism. So I have a clip here of Noam Chomsky, and this is a clip that's gotten a lot of views. It's like multiple places on YouTube. And this is Noam Chomsky's critique of Leninism. And it's bullshit. It's bullshit. And I'm going to play it here because I want people to see that this is bullshit. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I mean, it is bullshit. And it's disturbing that this is everywhere. I mean, Noam Chomsky's, critique of Leninism, it's called, right? And so Noam Chomsky, what was Leninism? And many people have seen this clip, and it says, that Lenin overturned workers' power, etc. So I'm going to play the clip, right? And we're going to go over what it says. We're just going to go through it. And Noam Chomsky does a lot of bluffing. He does a lot of bluffing in this clip. He assumes that you don't know. See, no bookish guy. He's done his reading. He's done his homework. He knows what he's talking about. He assumes that you don't, right? He assumes that you don't know what he's talking about. And so he bluffs. And that's what he does. And I'm trying to get it to upload the clip here. I'm trying to get it to put it in here. Let's just see. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So we're going to skip ahead to when he starts talking, right? Because there's a woman in the audience who's like a Trotskyist who asks Noam Chomsky, why do you equate Leninism with evil Stalinism? And then Noam Chomsky starts talking.
You only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek.
Okay, we'll go a little further back.
What I said is approximately what you said, except I didn't use some of that rhetoric. Which I don't think is particularly helpful, to tell you the truth, either analytically or to understand or whatever. But it's the same picture. John Jay had it straight. The people who own the country ought to govern it, and the people who own the country have basically now are a network of corporations and conglomerates and banks and so on. They ought to govern it, and the way they do it is by the methods we've described. Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons.
Well, that's not the reason that Trotsky was accused of aligning with fascism. That is not the reason. Okay, that is a straw man completely. The reason that Trotsky was widely accused of aligning with fascism was because in the lead up to the Second World War, he was condemning the Popular Front. The communists of the world were trying to build a united front against fascism. They were working with Roosevelt in the United States. They were working with, the British Labour Party and liberals in Britain. They were trying to build a united front against fascism, and Trotsky condemned it. And when France was invaded by the Nazis, Trotsky took an anti-war position, a revolutionary defeatist position. He said that the French Communist Party was wrong for pushing defense of the fatherland. So the reason that Trotsky was accused of aligning with fascists was because in the lead up to the Second World War, he was actively undermining the Popular Front and the effort of the communists to build a united front against fascism. When France was invaded, he was basically taking a revolutionary defeatist position. There are reasons that Trotsky was accused of aligning with fascists, other than simply that Trotsky had a critique similar to theirs. Trotsky went as far as being willing to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Dies Committee, it was called. Martin Dies, the conservative, had a committee to investigate Roosevelt for his ties to communists. And Leon Trotsky agreed to testify before the Dies Committee. He was going to get up before the Dies Committee and in an American, session of Congress, get up and condemn the Communist Party USA and try to, accuse Roosevelt of being a collaborator with Stalinism. So all of that is the reason Trotsky is accused of having ties to fascism. It's not that he said things that were similar.
So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists.
Wrong. That is absolutely wrong. Lenin was largely viewed as a left-wing deviation. In the lead up to World War I, all the major Marxist parties in Europe supported the war. They'd all signed a declaration that they would never support a war. The French communists said they would never, Marxists said they would never support a war. The British Labour Party, the German Social Democratic Party, all the major leftist and Marxist groups in Europe signed a pledge never to support the war. But then when the war started, they sold out. And Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Eugene Debs, they're among those who refused to support the war. And because of that, they were considered the left wing deviants. The mainstream of social democracy, the Second International, supported the war. Lenin and the Bolsheviks opposed the war. So no, they were not considered a right-wing deviation. They were considered to be a left-wing deviation of Marxism. The mainstream Marxist current, Karl Kautsky, was probably the mainstream figure. The most prominent Marxist in the Second International was Karl Kautsky. And Karl Kautsky had said he would oppose the war and then sold out and supported the war. Karl Kautsky wanted to build a mass party. Lenin said we need to build a group of fanatics, a party of new type. And that was considered ultra-left. In the critiques that the global Marxist movement had of Lenin before World War I were critiques that were to the right of Lenin. They considered Lenin to be to their right or to their left. They did not consider him to be to their right. Lenin was opposed to the war. Lenin wanted to build a party of new type, a revolutionary organization for people to give the whole of their lives. Lenin's entire critique of mainstream Marxism was a left critique. It was an anti-imperialist critique. It was not a right-wing critique. That's just wrong. That is just wrong what he's saying there. Lenin was aligned with Rosa Luxemburg. Lenin was aligned with Eugene Debs and praised Eugene Debs. Lenin was aligned with Sylvia Pankhurst in Britain, who was a very prominent British socialist who opposed World War I. Lenin was considered on the left wing of global Marxism. Karl Kautsky was the central figure. And then you had the right wing, the revisionists, people like Edward Bernstein and others. But Lenin was considered on the left wing of global Marxism with Sylvia Pankhurst, with Rosa Luxemburg, with Eugene Debs. He's just wrong in what he's saying there.
We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost. And you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek.
No. The mainstream Marxists were Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky was probably the German Social Democratic Party, was the biggest Marxist party in the world. It was half of the German government, was the German Social Democratic Party. And Karl Kautsky had condemned Bernstein and revisionism. And Karl Kautsky, they were the mainstream. The German Social Democratic Party was the mainstream Marxist party in Europe before World War I. You had the Labour Party in Britain. You had the French Socialist Party. You had, but yeah, I don't know who this Anton, whatever his name is, but he was not the mainstream of Marxism.
Who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement.
No, he was a left-wing critic. He was with Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and others. He was a left-wing critic of the Second International. He was not the mainstream.
Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist.
No, Rosa Luxemburg was not a mainstream Marxist. Rosa Luxemburg was so much of a non-mainstream Marxist that the Social Democrats, the mainstream Marxists, actually murdered her. Rosa Luxemburg was not a mainstream Marxist, and Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg were linked together. They were considered to be allies. Lenin, Luxemburg, they were considered to be very closely linked. The Spartacus Bund, or the Spartacus Uprising of 1919, the Bavarian Soviet Republic that was created in Bavaria, allies of the Bolsheviks. Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin were linked together as left critics of mainstream Marxism, which at that point was run by the Social Democratic parties. So he just has no clue it's not that he has no clue what he's talking about. He's playing an intellectual game here. He's rewriting history to fit his agenda, and he's assuming that you don't know any of these names. That's what he's doing, right? He's assuming you don't know any of this history. You're like, oh, Rosa Luxemburg was the mainstream of Marxism. Well, no, Rosa Luxemburg was a left Marxist who Lenin aligned himself with. The first Congress of the Communist International, of the Third International, began with a moment of silence in memory of Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg had criticism of Lenin, but they were considered to be allies because they were against the war. She supported the Bolshevik uprising. So, Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg were together, and they were considered to be left critics of mainstream Marxism.
There were others, and they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917.
False. Trotsky was to the right of Lenin. Trotsky did not want to break with the mainstream of Marxism. He didn't want to break with the Second International. He tried to form something called the August Bloc, which would be like a faction within the Menshevik Party, and it failed. Trotsky was not like Lenin. Lenin said we need to form a whole new party, which is a much more radical position. We're going to form a Bolshevik party that'll be separate from the Social Democrats and Marxists. Trotsky said, no, we're going to stay with the Social Democrats. We're going to stay with the Social Democrats, and we're going to try to form a radical faction within. And Trotsky and his followers tried to form an anti-war faction within the Mensheviks. And so, no, Trotsky was not a left critic that Lenin wasn't. No, Lenin was to the left of Trotsky. Trotsky was going around saying we need a United States of Europe, which was a position he wanted to unify all the countries of Europe. Lenin was saying, no, we need to support the colonized world and rising up to overthrow European imperialism, and bringing European imperialism together will strengthen. Lenin was very much to the left of Trotsky, and Lenin and Trotsky were to the left of mainstream Marxism. So he's just wrong.
They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism, the idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power, and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose.
Now, again, this is one of those things where there's a grain of truth in what he's saying. That's what Rosa Luxemburg said. Rosa Luxemburg was critical of the Leninist vanguard party. Trotsky was not. Right? Rosa Luxemburg, if you read what she writes, Marxism or Leninism, I think is the name of one of her pamphlets. She's calling for like direct workers' councils, and she's critical of the notion of the Bolshevik party. Right? That's correct about Rosa Luxemburg. However, it's not correct when it comes to Trotsky. Trotsky, his disagreement with Lenin was that he wanted Lenin to be more commandist and authoritarian. Lenin called for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. That was the policy, was that they would overthrow capitalism in Russia, and the dictatorship of the capitalists would be replaced by a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and the peasants. Trotsky disagreed with that. He said the peasantry was an inherently reactionary class, and so you had to have a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers, and you couldn't include the peasants. That the cities, the urban workers, should rule over the peasantry because they're an inherently reactionary class. So that's a more authoritarian, a more elitist position. Trotsky was more of an elitist, more of a vanguardist than Lenin was. Lenin wanted to have a party, a leadership, a revolutionary government of workers and peasants. Trotsky rejected the entire peasantry. That's a more elitist position, not a less elitist position. So that is not correct, what he's saying there. He's just wrong when he says that. Trotsky was much more of an authoritarian, much more of an elitist than Lenin was, because he rejected the peasantry.
That was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917.
Yeah, the left Marxists. See, the left Marxists, that was an isolated faction, right? Leninism and Bolshevism was considered part of the left Marxists, and the left Marxists were a really small faction. Marxism was a huge movement, and the mainstream current of Marxism was called social democracy. It was the Second International. And Bolshevism was one of the left-wing trends. And there were critiques of Bolshevism, of course, from Rosa Luxemburg, from others, but among left Marxists were fringe. They were small. It was the mainstream Marxist movement was Kautsky and German social democracy, and they were to the left of it. He's bluffing. He assumes you don't know what he's talking about, and he's playing head games.
Now, when Lenin came back to Russia, in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. If you take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism.
That was because they were on the brink of winning. The policies and the slogans that you will put forward are different when you're on the brink of taking power than they are when you're just trying to get a group of people together. But there's a consistency in the politics. Lenin didn't zigzag. He didn't change his politics. It's just they were on the brink of winning. In April of 1917, Lenin, with the help of German intelligence, mind you, the German intelligence agencies gave Lenin money and helped smuggle Lenin back to the Finland station, back into Russia. And with money from the Germans, we don't know how much, Lenin came back and he showed up and he said, guys, we actually have an opportunity to win here. We can become the new government, right? Playtime is over, guys. And he came out with his April thesis, his very famous April thesis, where he said we have to change our name. We have to call ourselves the Communist Party rather than the Social Democratic Party, because if we call ourselves Social Democrats, people will think we're like the sellout party that supported World War I. And he said, and we have to call for all power to the Soviets. The workers have built these councils, these Soviets, during the process of overthrowing the Tsar. We have to call for all power to the Soviets. Because they were winning. It's a tactical thing. What you call for when is based on what you can do. And the book, The State and Revolution, that Lenin published, this theoretical polemic that says we have to have a new state, it was published because Lenin was saying, look, if we're going to win, we have to create a new government. We have to have a government based on these workers' councils. We can't just get elected, because that's what the Social Democrats were saying, and the Mensheviks were saying, well, look, we're writing a new constitution, and then we'll have elections, and then we'll just get elected. And Lenin's saying, no, we need to have a new state. This is a struggle for state power. Again, that's not a deviation. That's not a zigzag. That's the same stuff he had always said. However, it was a moment where that was a critical question. What book you write when is not simply a matter of what you happen to think. It's a matter of tactics. And they were on the brink of taking power. So the April Thesis and the State and Revolution were published to justify the actions that the Bolsheviks were taking. They had to dramatically change their tactics in order to win. Lenin famously said that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. That's what he said. And he was arriving in April, where all of a sudden this country, Russia, that he'd been in his whole life, was in a state of upheaval. And there was an opportunity with their organization of, like 10, 20,000 people. They may actually be able to seize power based on maneuvers and alliances with different factions of the ruling class. So it wasn't a political shift. It was simply based on the fact that they had to change their tactics very dramatically in order to win.
Of the Panic-Luxembourg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for, a workers' organization and so on. And in fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things.
Well, no, it's not about workers' control over production. That is a deviation, right? That ultimately, if you read Marx, if you read Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels, if you read the Communist Manifesto, if you read Capital, if you read Grundrisse, if you read Proudhon, it's a struggle to get rid of the anarchy of production, to overcome production organized for profit. It is a struggle to overcome the chaos of the market. Under capitalism, production is only carried out in order to make profits for owners. Under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. We have the anarchy of production, where the economy is organized in order to make profits for private owners. And if you read Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Engels, Grundrisse, Capital, if you read any of the economics of Marxism, it's about getting to an economy that overcomes the irrationality of capitalism. What do you think about the Peace Corps? That's what it's about. And it's only through eradicating scarcity, by having the economy organized to serve society, that you can get to a society where inequality starts to fade away. The basis of inequality is scarcity. When there's not enough to go around, there's going to have to be some who have and some who have not. And that eradicating scarcity requires overcoming the built-in contradiction in capitalism. Under capitalism, you can have people be homeless because there are too many houses. Under capitalism, you have people hungry because there's too much food. Under capitalism, technological advancement makes people poorer. That's why everyone's terrified of self-driving cars, because under capitalism, self-driving cars will mean millions of truck drivers and cab drivers and Uber drivers will not have jobs. And socialism is about overcoming the artificial restraints on human productivity that are created by a system where your only value is selling labor, right? That's the problem, right? The built-in problem with capitalism is that under capitalism, the only value the worker has is by selling his labor to a boss. And because of that, because of the fact that under capitalism, that is your only value, technological progress leads to fewer workers at the assembly line. And it leads to artificial restraints where the more wealth that is created, the greater poverty there is. This is Marxism. This is Marxism. This is Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. Read chapter 3. It is all about this very issue. You read The Poverty of Philosophy by Marx. It's all about this issue. You read Grundrisse. It's all about this issue. Yes, the fact that the worker is alienated from his labor, that he rents himself out to his employer, the inequality of their relation, that's an aspect of Marxism. But the fundamental aim of Marxism is not simply to overcome the inequality between the worker and the employer. It's to get beyond capitalism, which is production organized for profit. It's to have the means of production function in a rational way so that human growth is no longer restrained. So he's just lying here. He's just wrong, right? That's a new left interpretation, right? That's the new left. That's the 1960s new left, right? The Soviet Union can't be socialist because every decision in every factory isn't democratic. But, me and my hippy dippy friends in Indiana, we can, have a pig farm together and we share everything. And that's socialism, even though we operate it for profit and sell our pigs on the market, and it's still dictated by the laws of market. So there you go. All right.
Beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that.
A coup. I mean, the demand was all power to the Soviets. There were three political parties, the left Mensheviks and the left Socialist Revolutionary Party. I mean, it wasn't a coup, right? It was an uprising. But yes, the Bolsheviks, the Marxist party, led by the Bolsheviks, they were at the center of it. But, there had been, these Soviets, these workers' councils created over the course of the uprising. And the Bolsheviks rose up and they led the thrust to create a Soviet government, to declare them as the government. But, they had built up their forces. They had beaten back the reaction. What is that called? The general, the reaction by the right-wing general who was marching in and wanted to establish a military dictatorship. The Kornilov reaction, General Kornilov was marching towards St. Petersburg, and they fortified the city, and the Bolshevik militias were bigger than the militias of the regular government. And, the military, the regular military was handing over, the armories and weapons to the Bolsheviks. And then after defeating the Kornilov reaction, the Bolsheviks said, look, our Soviets, our workers' councils are really where the power is. Our military is bigger, and we're the main party in the Soviets, along with the left Mensheviks and the left Revolutionary Party. So the left Socialist Revolutionary Party. So why don't we take power? Right? That's what happened. And that it was bringing the Soviets that were dominated by those three parties, but most especially dominated by the Bolsheviks, to power. It was this new government that had been created in the course of struggle and had really become empowered by defeating the Kornilov reaction. It was about bringing them to power. It wasn't a coup.
One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after Trotsky joined at that point.
That's false. Yeah, that's false. And in fact, if you read, I mean, I've got a number of books here I can point you towards. I mean, you know, there's like a study. One of these books here I have is like a study. Yeah, this is a great book. This is a study. It's called Revolution and Counter-Revolution: Class Struggle in a Metal Factory in Moscow. And this goes over exactly how things changed in the factory and how they kept the councils intact. The councils existed, but they had to centralize the economy. And how did the council that ran this metal factory and how it took directions from the state bureaucracy and all of that. But there were councils, there were committees, there was a huge bureaucracy in the Soviet Union that existed. The idea they just dissolved it all. And no, I mean, people were participating in running the economy. That's just false, what he just said there. They dissolved it all. Really? They just dissolved it all.
They took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just
wrong. All right, wrong. Lenin's writings after he seized power. You have this book, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. And who is he critiquing? He's critiquing Kautsky, who's one of these social democratic leaders who condemned the Bolsheviks for not getting elected and declaring a Soviet government without winning an election. He's saying, oh no, it's red terror. How dare they? And Lenin in this book is defending the right to have a revolution and saying you have the right to have a revolution. If you read it. And no, this is not a right-wing critique. This is a left-wing critique. He's critiquing Kautsky, who is condemning the Bolsheviks for not getting elected and actually having a revolution and creating a new state. And he, in this heated polemic, explains that, no, we are struggling to have a new state. And, he says, look, that yes, we can't, that if you're defending the norms of bourgeois democracy, you're forgetting how violent bourgeois democracy really is. And, and that, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like, that's just a misrepresentation. The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky is not a right-wing piece. It is a left-wing defense of the right to have a revolution. So he's just wrong on that count.
Like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power,
in fact, the first meeting of the Communist International, the very first meeting of the Communist International, I'm reading to you. I'll just read it to you. This is Lenin's speeches to the Communist International, right? And this is after he took power, when he sets up a new international Marxist parties. The very first speech, the very first one, right? This is the very first speech, March 2nd, his first speech on the first page of this book. His first speech, it begins with, on behalf of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party, I declare the first Congress of the Communist International open. First, I would like all present to rise in tribute to the finest representatives of the Third International, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. That's how his speech began. It began honoring Rosa Luxemburg, somebody that he said, that Lenin was to the right of and all that. His first speech to the Communist International begins with him honoring Rosa Luxemburg. It's in the text. It's right there in front of you. So no, this idea he diverted to being a right Marxist and all that. He opened his very first speech at the Communist International by honoring Rosa Luxemburg. So that's just bull honky. It's just bull honky.
Reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. socialism, at its core, Marxism strives for society to control the means of production so that growth can no longer be restrained by the irrationality of profits and command, and inequality can be overcome. No, it's not a struggle to set up a pencil factory where my friends we all share the profits of the pencils. It's so much fun. That's not what it is. It is a struggle for society to control the means of production, to rationally plan out so growth is no longer restrained, so production is organized to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few, so that growth can be unrestrained and inequality can break down and we can move toward an egalitarian society of greater abundance. No, it's not a struggle. It's not a struggle so that, the workers own the pencil factory and we all share everything. Yay! It's not what it is. That is not what it is. It is a struggle for society to control the means of production, overcome the irrationality of profits and command.
Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And same, you could say that.
And they had Soviets. Even up into the 80s, they had worker, bodies of workers at production. They had, workers' representation on the job and such. They had that. So just saying they got rid of it, that's not factual.
Effective instruments, and they had to be worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce.
Yeah, I really doubt that's anywhere in their writings. I really, really doubt that's anywhere in their writings, that they all submit to a single leader. Yes, we pick one man and he rules over all the other ones and no one has any freedom. It'll be called dictatorship. Why? Because we hate America and we hate freedom and democracy. One single leader who shall stand at the podium wearing a military uniform and pound upon the podium and give fiery speeches. Oh, yes, that's what we shall do. What do you think, Trotsky? Yes, I like it. Yes, one single leader. Show me one quotation from Lenin, from Trotsky, from Stalin, from any of them that says we should have one single leader who rules over anybody. This is a bunch of bullshit. He's pandering to anti-communist propaganda that we've all heard our whole lives. He should be ashamed of himself. Show me one quote that says we should have one single leader who all are subordinated to. Bullshit.
Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists.
And they were not mainstream. Yes, Rosa Luxemburg did criticize Lenin, before her death, and she did criticize the idea of centralizing the Soviet Union in the hands of the Bolsheviks. There were anarchist critiques, but these were left critiques. They were not mainstream critiques. The mainstream critique of the Bolsheviks was they didn't get elected. Was that they, had a revolution, right? That was the main critique of them. Proletarian revolution and the renegade Kautsky. Kautsky and all of them said, how dare you have a revolution? How dare you not just, wait until they have a constituent assembly? How dare you defend yourselves and declare this government that you created in the course of your struggle? How dare you allow that to become the new government amid the revolutionary chaos? And how dare you declare the Soviets to be the government? That was the main critique among Marxists. Social democracy and reformism critiqued them for having a revolution at all. The Rosa Luxemburg and the anarchist types did critique them for having central power. You had the Kronstadt Uprising, very famous, the Kronstadt Uprising. They said Soviets without communists, meaning no central party, no central authority, which you can't really do in the middle of a civil war. When 15 countries invade you and people are fighting for their lives, you can't have every local area just do whatever they want because it's like total democracy, man. I'm sorry, what the Kronstadt sailors wanted, and Soviets without communists, and what the left, the worker communists or the left, what were they called? The workers' opposition. What they wanted was not realistic. And you can read all about this if you read the history of the Bolshevik Party, right? The history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. They get into this in great detail about the workers' opposition.
And I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was...
Well, Cheka and the KGB were a highly politicized organization. They did not recreate the czarist system of oppression. This was a whole new secret police force, that because there were all kinds of forces infiltrating the Bolsheviks, there was all kinds of intelligence and intrigue and secret underground attempts to overthrow them. Yes, the Bolsheviks were forced to create their own secret police, and that became the KGB, or the Cheka, first, and then the KGB. But that was not the Tsar's institution. They had a whole new ideology. They served whole new purposes. There was a high representation of national minorities and non-Russian folks in them. I mean, they just, it's like, maybe it looked like, yeah, okay, the Tsar did have secret police. Yes, KGB was secret police, but it was a very different operation entirely. And it was much more sophisticated too.
Nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, it was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism. Now, you could, that's what I think happened, and I think that's what you discover if you look at
where is there, so what would look more like socialism, Noam Chomsky? What would look more like socialism? You say the Soviet Union looked nothing like socialism. What does socialism really look like, Noam? Can you point to one place that's your form of real socialism? Can you point to one place on Earth? No. And that's what these ultra-left critiques are all about, right? And this is the problem with them, is it's like socialism is really amazing as long as it just stays in your head. Socialism is really, really awesome and flawless as long as it's just in your mind. And if you want academics like Noam Chomsky to like you, if you really want the Noam Chomsky crowd and a bunch of college professors and the people at Left Forum to like you, you know how you do it? You lose. You lose. Then they'll like you, right? Rosa Luxemburg lost, and so we all love her, right? And the anarchists in Spain, they lost, and so we love them. But when you actually win, in order to stay in power, you have to have things like Cheka and the KGB. In order to stay in power, you have to suppress the people that are trying to overthrow you. In order to stay in power, you need to be able to fight off those 15 countries that invade after the Russian Revolution. And then it suddenly doesn't become all happy, fun, romantic, hippy-dippy, child's play anymore. And if you actually win, it stops being, romantic. And that there starts being a lot of ugly things when you actually win. And that's why Noam Chomsky, that looked nothing like socialism. Nothing looks like socialism. The only socialism he's ever seen is in his head, right? I mean, there was one of these groups, the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. They were a group of like these ultra-left trots. And they put out a book of like the 5 times workers have taken power. It was the Paris Commune of 1871. Well, the Paris Commune was great, but it stayed in power for 8 weeks. So, it was great. It was a great 8 weeks, but, that's not exactly the ideal model. And then it was like right after the Russian Revolution. And then it was in Iran for like a year after the Iranian Revolution. And then it was Hungary in 1956, which was a fascist CIA coup that like neo-Nazi kind of people were funded by the CIA to overthrow the Bolsheviks and such. And then it was Poland in the 80s, like the uprisings of Solidarność, also CIA. Like those are the only times they think anything close to socialism's ever happened. Half of them are CIA uprisings, and the rest of them are things that lasted about 8 weeks. I mean, who cares what these people think socialism is? I mean, according to them, this is the problem. As long as socialism just remains in your head, it's going to be all pretty, and it's going to be all fancy, and it's going to be all ultra democratic and egalitarian and all of that. But the real world is different. The real world is very, 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 very different.
Facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. The Soviet Union calls it socialism. And after they took control they did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily of the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark,
And that's false too. Social democracy remained a huge current. The British Labour Party was socialist. They were, social imperialists, social democrats. They didn't support the Bolsheviks. I mean, the Socialist Party of the United States, Norman Thomas. I mean, that's false too. Social democracy remained a very powerful anti-communist current after the Bolshevik Revolution, and they opposed it. Social democracy exists all over the world. Maybe not in the United States very much since the 50s, but I mean, the Bolsheviks took over the whole socialist movement. I'm sorry, that just didn't happen. Social democracy remained very, very powerful and anti-communist. And social democracy went into an anti-communist frenzy after the war. They said the main enemy is on the left. The Weimar Republic in Germany was run by social democrats who killed communists. No, the international socialist movement was not taken over by the Bolsheviks, but all the serious people, the people who actually wanted socialism, the ones who weren't reformers, that didn't just want to become managers of capitalism, those who didn't just want to be the lower lieutenants of capital, right? Those who wanted to actually see socialism. Yes, the real revolutionary forces joined the communists. That's true. But no, the idea that they took over the whole socialist movement, I'm sorry, that didn't happen.
Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly. He kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They would just kind of hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany.
And that's not true either, and that's Trotskyite propaganda. And if you read Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he explains why you couldn't have a revolution in Germany, and you couldn't have a revolution in these Western capitalist countries. He said the revolutionary energy would be in the East, and it would be in the colonized world. No, he did not say it would be a holding action. And furthermore, Lenin, before his death, he said, communism is Soviet power plus electrification, meaning that if we can, the revolutionary Soviet power we built up, if it can take control of great machinery, that's what electrification meant back then, power plants and great machinery of production. If Soviet power, what we have here, can take control of a modern industrial economy, that's socialism. Read it. That is a direct quote from Lenin. Communism is Soviet power plus electrification. And Stalin did it. Stalin built up, with the government that Lenin created, he built electrification. Soviet power plus electrification. That's a direct quote from Lenin. Communism is Soviet power plus electrification. And while Trotsky had this illusion that the Soviet Union should just remain, should just basically exist as an arm of an entity to help communism come to the Western capitalist countries, Lenin understood why it wouldn't. And his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, explains that the aristocracy of labor and other issues were going to make it extremely difficult to have a revolution in a Western capitalist country at that time. And that his writing on the collapse of the Second International, everywhere, he writes in great detail about how you couldn't have a revolution in Britain and France and these other countries at that time because of the aristocracy of labor and how the revolutionary energy was going to come from the East. What did the Bolsheviks do after they took power? Yes, they had the Communist International, but what did they convene? They convened the Congress of the Peoples of the East, and they invited the Emir of Afghanistan, and they invited Sun Yat-sen, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the Chinese KMT, and they invited all the colonized people of the world, people from Africa, people from Asia, and they said, anyone who's going to fight the British Empire, anyone who's going to fight the American imperialists, anyone who's going to fight the French, the colonizers, we're with you. Lenin's focus was on the colonized world rising up against the West. That's what Lenin's focus was on. Yes, they built the Communist International, but they understood that the revolutionary energy was coming from the East. Read about the Baku conference that they convened in Azerbaijan, where they invited anybody, didn't care what you were. The Emir of Afghanistan was this feudal monarch. They said, hey, you're going to fight the British? Here's guns. Anyone who will fight the imperialists. The essence of Leninism is fighting imperialism. It's about fighting imperialism. That is the essence of what Lenin was all about. He understood that imperialism was capitalism in its monopoly stage. The imperialism was leading to the West becoming barbaric and primitive, and cruel and sadistic, and losing any notion of being civilized and becoming a society based on war and cruelty. And he understood that countries around the world were being kept in chronic poverty. He understood that the workers in Western countries were being divided. and that ultimately the defeat of Western capitalism would come by mobilizing the world. Let me repeat that, the world against imperialism. That was the focus of Leninism. It wasn't, let's just wait until those workers in Germany and those workers in Britain, seize their factory and turn their factory into a cooperative. I'm sorry, that's not the essence of Bolshevism. Bolshevism was an anti-imperialist ideology. It said imperialism was the enemy and that it was about mobilizing a global struggle against imperialism.
Because the revolution, according to Marxist doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that
that was orthodox Marxism. Lenin broke with that. Lenin's whole book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, breaks with that theory. It says that no, the revolution won't come in the most centralized and developed countries. That's what Marx said, and Lenin famously broke with that in his very important book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Lenin broke with that part of Marxism, and that he broke with it. And he said, no, it will be the colonized world that will have socialism first.
Read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action.
No,
and that presumably gave
said. That's what Trotsky said. That's not what Lenin said.
Some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the mainstream Marxist tradition.
No, he broke with that. This is infuriating. This is infuriating. The entire essence of Leninism is breaking with the Eurocentrism of Marx and saying that the revolutionary energy, because of imperialism, because of the aristocracy of labor, the revolutionary energy in that time, in the 20th century, was going to be in the colonized countries of the world.
After that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. It's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism. And they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own and quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism.
And that's not true either. Germany was run by social democrats. The British Labour Party was very powerful in Britain. Social democracy has been a very big aspect of Western capitalist society for a long time after the Bolshevik Revolution. What he's talking about is, yes, in the 1950s in the United States, they purged any pro-socialist thinking. They equated anyone who said they were at all socialistic with communism. That was very United States. That was very American. It wasn't like that. I'm sorry, but in Britain and in France and in Germany, social democracy was everywhere, and they held up the social democrats as the good socialists who aren't like those evil Bolsheviks. He's wrong. He's just wrong. That was true in the 1950s in America and during the Cold War in the United States. Post World War II, after McCarthyism, wasn't true globally.
And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but they basically agreed, and that then became doctrine and dogma. Well, I think people should ask whether that's true. Take a look back and see whether the moves that Lenin took and that Trotsky supported him in taking and that they both advocated had anything to do with socialism as it was understood by, say, in the Marxist tradition or in the left libertarian tradition. And I think the answer that you'll discover when you look at that is that they didn't. In fact, this was a destruction of socialist institutions. Well, this may be true or it may be false, but if it's true, and I think the evidence pretty strongly supports it, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't express that fact. And I certainly don't think that we should be deterred in expressing this fact if other people who's, fascists, whatever, happen to condemn the Soviet Union, just for the same reasons that Trotsky mentioned in the 1930s.
All right, folks. That's enough, Noam Chomsky. There, it's just It's frustrating to see somebody get up there, and again, that's sophisticated ignorance, right? He dropped a whole bunch of names on his audience that they didn't know. He dropped a whole bunch of dates and facts. He mixed in some very, very true things with some very, very false things. That's sophisticated ignorance, and it's more dangerous, right? If people don't know anything about what they're talking about, it's one thing, but when people know what they're talking about and they're twisting it, it's more dangerous.